Thank you so much for your attention. I shall be making the final introduction for this rather remarkable year that has had a number of events. It is really a great pleasure to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Jong. Needless to say that when his extraordinary book, Traditions of the Magi, was finished and published, I was still trying to finish my own dissertation, so at the time I hated him greatly. So Jong is professor of the study of religion in the at the University of Leiden, again in the Netherlands. He certainly is among the most remarkable Iranists of his generation, although this might be a doubtful compliment. Having been trained in theology, all Iranian languages and Persian literature, both in Leiden and at the University of London. The focal point of Jong's research and teaching is a study of religion in general, and in particular the religious history of Iran from the earliest period to the present. His current research project is the ambitious and greatly anticipated study, The Religious History of the Sasanian Empire, that represents the 5th volume of the prestigious series, A History of Zoroastrianism, initiated by the great Mary Boyce, and shall cover not only the history of Zoroastrianism as an isolated phenomenon, but in interaction with other religious communities, such as the Christian, Jewish, Manichaean, and Mandean communities, during a crucial period of their development. Among Professor de Jong's most valuable contributions, I should mention his influential book, Traditions of the Magi, Zoroastrianism in Greek and Latin Literature, published with Brill 2 decades ago, and a number of authoritative publications, among them Being Iranian in Antiquity in 2017, The Disintegration and Death of Religions in 2016, and Religion and Politics in Pre-Islamic Iran, most important article in 2015, just among some of his many publications. In his lecture today, Ab shall be discussing the changing fortunes of the study of Zoroastrianism in today's academia, which, although an important part and subject in the early years of the history of religions as a new discipline, has now slowly faded out of the conscious of all but a handful of specialists in academia. Ab's lecture will attempt at providing the historique of this neglect and offer a way out for the field. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here on this special day. Well, Michael, John and I turned it into a special day that brings to an end, this is what we did, the first year of the activities of the Pourdavoud Center for the Study of the Iranian World. I was here last year when the center was inaugurated, and it is immensely gratifying to be able to record with admiration how much has been achieved in a year. And I hope my remarks today will help the center, the wider scholarly community at UCLA, as well as a much larger community behind the ideals of the Pourdavoud Center, to find courage and purpose in setting an agenda for the study of the Iranian world. Such an agenda should primarily be a scholarly one, and the fundamental requirement for sound scholarship is that it must be allowed to be conducted for its own sake, even when, as is often the case, certainly in my case, the immediate purpose of certain questions, subjects, or efforts may not always be obvious. Having said that, it would be disastrous to pretend that such a scholarly agenda can bear fruit when it takes no cognizance of or bears no relevance to questions that confront wider society. The key to the survival of the humanities at large, and I believe that we need to fight for the survival of the humanities, the key to it, I think, must be sought in an unapologetic dedication to the ideals of truth and of beauty, coupled with sincere efforts to make the fruits of that dedication relevant to larger contemporary issues. So let me illustrate this with an example that has persecuted me for as long as I can remember. When I was doing my doctoral research, I spent quite some time thinking through the question why Zoroastrian sources of the early Islamic period, the so-called Pourdavoud books, tell us that it is an example of pure evil to walk around on one shoe.
This sin, called eumog dvarishni, which simply means walking on one shoe, is mentioned in a large number of passages as something uniquely evil, and in similar texts in Persian, parents are instructed to make sure that even their young children do not make themselves inadvertently guilty of it. There's no immediately obvious explanation for this rule given anywhere, and I sought, as you would probably expect, to find examples of a similar sensitivity to this kind of unmirrored behavior in other ancient societies. And what I found was frankly stupefying. Fellow historians from all sorts of different contexts have found evidence for and discussions of the very practice of walking on one shoe, which is especially common in works of art and in myth. They have even coined a technical term for it. This is ritual monosandalism. And there is a rich literature on it, none of which I found even remotely useful. So many examples are, I guess, well known. Jason, beware of the soldier wearing one shoe, that is him. Empedocles, the soldiers at Plataea, Queen Dido before her tragic end, the ritual of the levirate marriage in Deuteronomy, etc. I mean, there are really many examples of monosandalism. So this is not the point. I'm not going to solve it for you today. So when my fellow students found out that I was working on this and that I was thinking through this, they have made fun of me for months. And they wanted to punish me for thinking through something as laughable as this. So surely nothing could be relevant about it. But the levity with which we usually discuss this, including the way I discuss it right now, stands in stark contrast to the seriousness with which the subject was brought up in Zoroastrian sources themselves. And it always reminds me of that old slander used to illustrate the silliness of scholastic theology, right? That medieval theologians would discuss the question, how many angels can dance on the tip of a needle? First of all, as I'm sure you all know, they did not actually debate this question. But more importantly, had they done so, this would not have been silly in the least, as Richard Gordon showed a long time ago. For essentially the question would address the absolutely vital subject of the interpenetration of the spiritual and the material realms, which would lead straight into the heart of Eucharistic theology. So seen from that light, there is nothing ridiculous about the question any longer. And this is also true, I think, of the Zoroastrian rule against walking on one shoe. It is part of a wider set of rules and anxieties that make explicit the necessity of protecting the body and the mind of the believers against the permanent threat of being assaulted by the forces of evil. So perfection from this viewpoint equals wholeness, and being partially shod equals being vulnerable. So there are at least two vital lessons to be learned from this seemingly trivial subject. And the first is that we may not be the best arbiters of relevance the moment we attempt to understand the thought systems of others. And the second is that things that look the same, or even things that are the same, do not necessarily have identical meanings. And as trivial as these 2 points may sound, or may be, they are actually lessons that most Western observers, including most Western scholars, have found extremely difficult to learn. So ours is an intellectual culture that is rooted in the firm belief that we are right, and that we are right both morally and intellectually, and more importantly, that there is an unbreakable connection between these two domains of science and morality, and that has not equipped us very well to understand sort of the thought worlds of many others. Now I promise I will stop the sermon and we'll move to the history of Zoroastrianism. So 10 years ago, Michael Stausberg published an overview of the current state and the prospects of the study of Zoroastrianism in the highly regarded, if somewhat traditional journal Numen, the journal of the International Association for the History of Religions. As he noted himself, this was the first article on Zoroastrianism in that journal to be published in many decades, and a quick glance at most other journals in the study of religion showed that the same situation obtained there. This was in marked contrast to the state of affairs right after the Second World War, when Zoroastrianism had managed to retain a place of some prominence in general debates in the history of religions. And if we go back even further to the early days of the academic study of religion, as we will do in a moment, we will see that Zoroastrianism was fairly prominent among scholars of that first pioneering generation. So what happened? I mean, this is the subject for today, and I will try to show
how both the study of the Iranian world and the academic study of religion have had to pay a price. The large-scale avoidance of theory in Iranian studies has made the results of research in that field much less relevant and salient to scholars who want to understand religion as a historical human phenomenon. And the avoidance of Iranian subjects by students of religion complicates efforts in that field to generate hypotheses about religion as a historical phenomenon. So both sides have sort of paid a fairly heavy intellectual price for sort of an atmosphere of mutual lack of interest. How did we get there? And more importantly, how can we move on? For this, we need a very quick, it's actually going to take up most of our time, overview of the history of the study of Zoroastrianism in Western intellectual history. That history has never been written, and I've been assured by the same Michael Strausberg that if I would ever sit down and write it, no one would be interested in reading it. If that is true, I would be inclined to interpret that as a telling symptom of the state of affairs, because the story of European and American interest in Zoroastrianism is a long one and is a very important one. It is a story, however, that needs to be told by taking into account what I usually call the mental maps. I've already done this on this very place, the mental maps on which scholars have attempted to place the particular religion. So let's start with the first of them. And don't worry, I will not be comprehensive. The first of them is Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era about the Persian Wars. And his histories are famous for including a number of so-called ethnographic excursus on various ancient peoples, including the Persians. So their customs, nomoi, are discussed in 10 extremely interesting chapters in the first book of the histories. And these chapters begin and end with what we nowadays would call religion. Understanding the religion of the Persians was clearly an intellectual challenge to Herodotus, for he famously describes them mainly in terms of things they do not have. So he starts by saying they do not have cult statues, they do not have temples, they do not have altars, they don't have anything normal. I mean, that is the sort of the core message. And he explains this to himself by intuiting that they do not think of their gods as having a human shape, as do his contemporary Greeks. And the only gods he discusses in this part of the histories are natural phenomena, so they're the winds and mountains and rivers and other things. And even great Zeus himself, he writes, is seen by the Persians as present in the sphere of heaven. And when he talks about sacrifice, he more or less does the same. Again, there's this list of things they don't do. There's no procession, there's no playing of flutes, there's no barley strewn on the sacrificial animal. Again, nothing is normal. And it gets worse. So more strikingly, nothing of the sacrificial animal is actually offered to the gods. And the person who has ordered and presumably paid for the sacrifice does not ask for divine rewards for himself, but merely sort of invokes blessings on the king and on the Persians in general, and thus sort of including himself in that collective. Now, one of the things in which I agree with my dear colleague Michael Jong is that this is not immediately sort of amenable to historical reading, even though it would be extremely important. And there has been an enormous debate over these descriptions, which are the oldest surviving descriptions of the Persian religion in existence. For a long time, as I'm sure you know, Herodotus has not been seen as a very reliable source, and most classicists have tended, very wisely, to mine his description of the religion of the Persians, mainly for what it can tell about Herodotus' own religious thought. For me, the only thing that matters now is that it should be clear that in the world of Herodotus, so on the mental map of Herodotus, there would be no other option available than to represent Persian religion in terms of what I usually call a community religion, similar to what we nowadays call Greek religion. There would be no other model sort of that he knew of. But Herodotus' own amazement about the intentions of the sacrifice seems to show that he may have misunderstood a fundamental aspect of Zoroastrianism, and this is the fact that Zoroastrianism is not wholly similar to ancient Greek or Egyptian religion, in that it would be the more or less accidental form of religion that is typical for the Persian nation. Zoroastrianism, in my reconstruction, and I'll talk about my enemies later, is the earliest example of a type of religion whose main characteristic is the fact that it denies the importance of birth or of lineage or of ethnicity. but sees itself as a community that is defined by the religion and not the other way around. That was a notion that was clearly not available to early Greek observers, and this becomes evident 2 generations later, in the late Achaemenid period, when some Greek writers began to represent Zoroastrianism in a completely different way. Once again, they had to make do with whatever sort of was available to them, and in this case, some of them chose a tradition that had just come into being of representing schools of thought. And this type of reporting on Zoroastrianism treats it in a way that is strikingly similar to the way schools of philosophy were being represented, as a propositional system spearheaded by a person called Zoroaster, who would have taught these metaphysical truths to his pupils, the Magi. And from that moment onward, what I sometimes call the ethnographic and the doxographic representations of Zoroastrianism are both found. I keep forgetting my PowerPoint. No, we're still here. I'm still fine. Are both found, but usually in separate branches of literary genres. And essentially, this didn't change for a very long period, even when the type of religion to which Zoroastrianism belongs came to dominate the world at the expense of the much more ancient community religions, eventually declassed as paganism or idolatry. So Jewish, Christian, and Muslim writers, they either tried to make sense of Iranian religion by reporting on things they had witnessed personally or knew from hearsay, or they did so by representing it as a school of thought. And nowhere do we find attempts to join up these 2 modes of representation, and you will not be surprised to learn that at a certain moment this ethnographic mode tends to disappear. It disappears with the marginalization of Zoroastrianism after the Arab conquest of Iran. At a certain moment there are no longer Zoroastrians around to report on. A few centuries after these conquests, Zoroastrianism transformed from a subject of current concern to one of historical interest only. And for that purpose, it lingered on exclusively in an increasingly unhistorical doxographic mode. Except in the West. I mean, this is our next step. So interest in Zoroaster as a person, but not so much in Zoroastrianism, something no one knew existed, but interest in Zoroaster was rekindled in Europe in the Renaissance, especially by the Italian philosopher Marsilio Ficino, with his concept of the Prisca Theologia, of which Zoroaster would be a very important sort of forerunner. And so the Prisca Theologia would be sort of the pristine theology that had eventually sort of culminated in the truth of Christianity, and by Agostino Steuco and his concept of Philosophia Perennis, which works slightly differently. And both men and a wide range of similar authors struggled with imposing theological and philosophical questions about the reliability of God in light of the comparatively late manifestation of his revelation, and about the relation between Plato and Christian thought. It is generally agreed that in these writings, even though Zoroaster is very present in them, Zoroaster was largely a cipher. So he was merely a name or screen onto which sort of many ideas could be projected. And this is a tradition with a very long history in the following centuries, actually up to, I guess, up to the present, but certainly sort of Nietzsche's Zarathustra and the Bhagwan Zarathustra firmly belong in this tradition. So in these following centuries, and especially in the 17th century, Europeans came into contact with living Zoroastrian communities, mainly in India, because the coast of Gujarat, where most Parsis were living at the time, were prime areas where the rising colonial empires of the Dutch and the British set up their factories and trading emporia. And it is from the 17th century, therefore, that we have the first full, and literally also recognizable reports on the religion of the Parsis. A famous English description by Henry Lord, which culminates sort of memorably in a fierce attack on Roman Catholicism, and a much more comprehensive Dutch one, that remained in manuscript form and was published only in the 20th century by a certain Wollebrand Gelijnsen de Jong, who was leader of the factory in Surat and employed sort of many Parsis. You see him on this painting. Additional materials came from European travelers to Iran, who made occasional references to the Gabrs they had encountered. And all these reports are, if you like, firmly in the ethnographic mode, describing in extremely interesting ways the information on the religion that these colonial administrators and adventurers had assembled. Their reports are confused as a result,
It's sometimes very difficult, even on the level of words and names, very difficult to figure out what they're talking about. So their reports are confused, and they were barely received in circles of learning, who very much preferred this tradition. Yeah, this was one they could deal with. This was one they found difficult to deal with. To us, now, in the 21st century, they're extremely interesting. Because they reproduce more or less how 17th century Parsis represented their own religion to their European employers. And interestingly, in light of some of the remarks Michael Jong made and some of the things that dominate sort of discourse in Iranian studies, the memory of the imperial period of Zoroastrian history does not play any role in this self-representation. For those of you with a greater interest in ancient Iran than in the history of its study, this is a hugely interesting parallel to the vexed question of the memory of the Achaemenids in Iranian historiography. In the latter case, it was the conquest of Alexander and the trauma this produced that overshadowed and in the end destroyed the memory of the Achaemenids. In the case of Parsi self-representation, this was the role played by the Arab conquest. So basically, the Sasanians, whatever sort of was there, was overshadowed by the one fact that mattered, which was that the Arabs came and destroyed the land. I've noticed more often that this apparently happened fairly early in Zoroastrian history. The Middle Persian books on the 9th century are much less interested in the Sasanians than Iranian writers who had become Muslims. And this situation seems to have made the exotic information from travelers and colonial administrators less relevant to European scholars and intellectuals. It didn't answer their needs, essentially. So it was just seen as reports on a bunch of pagans. To this, there is one important exception. You all know him, I guess, and that is, of course, Thomas Hyde, who published in 1700 the first book-length study of ancient Persian religion, so-called, and who prided himself, and not unfittingly, precisely because in assembling his information he had made use of authentic Zoroastrian texts. And this is true. This is so Hyde owned 3 Zoroastrian manuscripts in Avestan, but he was unable to read them. He could make out a few letters, a few words, but he was unable to read them. So he had to make do with Zoroastrian sources in Persian, and these he used. He used the biography of the Prophet, the Zarathushnameh, and especially the Saddar, so a treatise on 100 subjects. And most of his information came from sources in Arabic, which was the subject of his first chair in Oxford. So famously, Hyde is the inventor of the word dualism, which was invented specifically to make sense of Zoroastrianism. His work had a second edition in 1760, and some 10 years before that date, so there is some national pride occasionally shining through. Some 10 years before that date, a young French Jansenist called Abraham Hyacinthe Anquetil du Perron left his native Paris to study in Amersfoort, where the Jansenists had set up a place of learning. So basically, he was a student in Holland before he became world famous. And when he had acquired all the knowledge he needed, he returned to Paris and famously was shown a facsimile of one of the Avestan manuscripts kept in Oxford. And he decided to gain fame by retrieving the knowledge of India as well as that of the ancient Persians. And this he actually did. So he went to India in a time of open war between Britain and France, not only in Europe but in India as well. And to cut a very long and very adventurous story short, thanks to the services of his brother and of the ever-helpful Dutch, Anquetil du Perron managed to to bring together a large collection of Zoroastrian manuscripts, many of them written for him specifically. And he also managed to be instructed somewhat by some Parsi priests on their meaning and on sort of how to read them. And this he took with him back to France, where he gained instant fame, especially when his 3-volume Les d'Avesta was published in 1771. And this was a moment of immense importance for France and ultimately for Europe as a whole. Its consequences were potentially immense for 2 closely interrelated reasons. The first is that before Anquetil du Perron, Zoroaster had become a figure of hope and expectations for Enlightenment philosophers, who had long desired to find a source of wisdom and morality
outside and preferably earlier than the Bible, and believed they had found it in whatever they believed to know about Zoroaster. And their expectations were completely shattered by the publication of Anquetil du Perron's Avesta, leading to the famous outburst of Voltaire, who wrote about the trash that one attributes to Zoroaster, and felt that Nostradamus and piss prophets were compared favorably to the madmen whom Anquetil du Perron had made known. Only some decades after in Zadig, Voltaire had produced his own sort of philosophical Zoroastrian as the main protagonist of that work. So this is one thing that happened. On the other hand, Anquetil du Perron's discoveries, which further included the first European work on the Upanishads, again translated from the Persian, but still he made the Upanishads popular, and so his discoveries in the end did lead to an enormous intellectual revolution. And this was immortalized by Raymond Schwab in his famous work La Renaissance Orientale, who notes that with the publication of Les Zen d'Avesta, the world became round, it became planetary for the first time, and that the workshops of the linguists gave rise in Europe, together with some fruitful and some murderous ideas, gave rise to the notion that an alternative, an external intelligence and soul had once existed. So for him, and I think sort of as a student of religion, this is imaginable. I think Zoroastrianism was an instrument in breaking through the system with which Christian theology had made sense of diverse religions, which essentially recognized, as I'm sure you know, only three: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and put all the other ones in a separate sort of in a dustbin, essentially, called paganism or idolatry or heathenism, whatever you want to call it. Zoroastrianism made this system impossible. And that is why Anquetil du Perron matters much more than he matters for Iranian studies. But that idea did not take root immediately. On the contrary, as I'm sure many of you know, a fierce and very painful battle ensued over the question of the authenticity of the Avesta. This for the simple reason that it couldn't be true, right? We knew Zoroaster was different. This was about people bathing in cow urine and other sort of unpleasant things. It just couldn't be true. So we don't have time for this, or I'd like to stress that although the outcome of that debate fully vindicated Anquetil du Perron, while damaging his reputation as an expert in the languages themselves, the debates themselves have had an important shadow side. So during the battle, the idea took root that the Avesta was not so much a source for religion as it was a source for language. And this has persisted throughout the 19th century and has led to the situation that the fact that Zoroastrianism was still a living religion that might have something to say about the text has meant little to nothing to most scholars working on its early history, and that continues to the present. Now, as I'm sure you've noticed, ladies and gentlemen, the entity that has been rather absent from everything I've been saying so far is Iran. And in the same period that scholars were that scholars were studying the Avesta, they were also unlocking the secrets of other Iranian languages. Persian had obviously been studied for centuries in Europe, but the 19th century added to this at least Old Persian through the momentous decipherments of Grotefend and Rawlinson, and Middle Persian, largely based again on Zoroastrian literature. The result of this was ultimately that Iranian studies developed into two distinct academic fields. There was Old Iranian studies on the one hand, and Persian on the other hand, which to this day are only rarely combined in a single department. Usually, so when I was a student, Old Iranian studies was part of Indology, and Persian was part of Middle Eastern studies. Yeah, this was fairly normal at the time. So the implication of this was that the field of Iranian studies came to be sort of experienced on the basis of a religious narrative, the narrative of the Islamization of Iran. And I don't think anything can thrive if it's based on a religious narrative, and it certainly has had enormous implications for the history of Zoroastrianism, which was seen as a religion that had lost all relevance for modern realities, was therefore rarely taught in sort of Middle Eastern studies programs or in Persian departments, and the only relevance that people could think of was perhaps the important exception of the affluent and westernized community of the Parsis.
Right, since the languages, the few specialists who took an interest in the field worked on were dead languages, they increasingly treated the religion conveyed in these texts as a dead religion, and the fact that it was not was seen as of limited relevance to what they thought their task was. I mean, you should read sort of Zehner, and Zehner literally says in the late Sasanian period they stopped believing everything. That they are still here now is something traditional, but they don't actually believe anything of it. So it's in exactly this period and exactly this mood that the academic study of religion came into being. The watershed moment was, of course, the momentous vote in the Dutch Parliament of 1876 and the finalization of the new law on higher education in 1877, which divested theology from the universities but kept it there nonetheless. This is a typical Dutch solution in a system that has been buried only a few years ago that was known as the duplex ordo, the double order. So there would be a strictly secular program of the study of religion taught by and under the auspices of the university, which would then sort of re-identify as a secular institution, and that would serve as preparation for a training for the ministry that would be governed by the Dutch Reformed Church, and that would be in the university, but not of the university, or some sort of wordplay with prepositions there. So the first professor of this academic study of religion was the celebrated Cornelis Petrus Thiele, who was, among many other things, a specialist in Zoroastrianism. I keep saying he's the only person who has ever written 2 books on Zoroastrianism in Dutch. So were many others who occupied the chairs that were soon established after the Leiden one. So this mushroom, many of them also were his students, but you can see them sort of moving all over Europe, and many of them worked on Zoroastrianism. There are several reasons for this. Not all of them very happy memories. I think so. The tacit agreement was always that the study of religion, Religionswissenschaft in German, would not deal with Judaism or Christianity. You know, they were served by completely different. So essentially, the study of religion meant the study of religion, with the exception of Judaism and Christianity. The colonial empire the Dutch maintained also made Islam a subject hors categorie. So essentially it was not included in the study of religion either. So the main efforts in setting up new programs in the study of religion devolved onto specialists in ancient religions as well as the religions of Asia. Yeah, so this is why they have dominated, but it's true. So I think even if you read less biased historiographies of the study of religion that do not say that the world changed with the vote in Dutch Parliament in 1876, it is absolutely clear that the greatest contributions to the study of religion were made by people working on on community religions in Africa, Oceania, so on the anthropology of religion, and by people working on the religion of antiquity and on the religions of India especially, and rarely by people working on Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. Meanwhile, Iranian studies had a different history. But the pre-Islamic Iranian world was almost never institutionalized as a field or as a program. It remained until very recently a more or less accidental field of special expertise maintained by scholars whose primary task was a different field. So that most specialists, almost by accident it seems, ended up there. I would locate in this development the root of the situation that increasingly students of Iran had little training in the study of religion, and students of religion had little to no training in Zoroastrianism. And the results of this are evident from even the briefest glance, which is all we can afford at the moment, at the developments in the 20th century. That was a century I'll leave this for you for a while. The 20th century is a century of unbelievable discoveries, which drew some of the greatest scholars in the humanities as a whole to the field of Iranian studies. There was so much work to be done, and there was such an enormous excitement about new languages to be deciphered, new texts to be published, and new thought worlds to be opened, that the answer to the many vital questions in Iranian religious history were generally sought in the hope for new sources that would shed light on them. This is a mood that still persists, I think, in Islamic studies. Many of these sources, however, did not answer, that is the usual, what always happens, they didn't answer these particular questions, but they did something else. They did not immediately fit into the narrative of Zoroastrian history that had taken shape in the 19th century.
And so many scholars were led, I'm going too quickly, many scholars were led to postulate the existence of a large variety of Iranian religions, essentially conjuring up a new independent religion for almost every source that emerged. And the consequences for the study of Zoroastrianism were enormous, for Zoroastrianism increasingly came to be seen as a marginal phenomenon that somehow, miraculously, had managed to survive amidst a lot of competitors. From Indo-Iranian Menabunda to non-Zoroastrian Mazdaism to Iranian Mithraism to Sogdian religion and Bactrian religion and so on and so forth. It is still with us. So, and these are all religions whose main characteristic seems to have been that scholars passionately believed that they were not Zoroastrianism but something else. Remarkably, no one in antiquity or in the Middle Ages or in any other period you can sort of imagine ever gave even the tiniest hint that such a multiplicity of religions had once existed. And the most economic solution to this is that they did not exist, that they are all what I call ghost religions, on the example of ghost words. So they are scholarly fantasies. There is a lot of presumably immensely depressing work to be done here, but it is necessary if we are to understand the remarkable achievement of Mary Boyce, however much she is misrepresented and misunderstood in contemporary scholarship. Against the backdrop of what can only be described as a freak show, she represented Zoroastrianism as a unitary phenomenon. And in this, I think she was largely correct. She was one of the first scholars, and regrettably also one of the last, to take seriously the fact that Zoroastrianism is a living religion and that should mean something. But her general aversion to theory, which was real, led her to represent this religion in a way that is difficult to accept by others, or that is difficult to harmonize with normal historical scholarship. So essentially, she believed that the connections that exist, and they do exist, the connections that exist between the earlier Zoroastrian texts and living priestly practice can only be explained by assuming that Zoroaster was a great teacher of men, and that the form of Zoroastrianism that has survived is exactly the form of Zoroastrianism that the prophet himself had hoped to establish. It is a small historical miracle, but this is the core message, I think, of her history. This is it ended up precisely the way it should have ended up. This allowed her, and we all missed this instrument, so this gave her an instrument. It allowed her to use this reconstructed version of what she called Orthodox Zoroastrianism as an instrument by which to judge all existing and newly discovered sources. So basically, if you have it, you have a source and you can say, well, it fits or it doesn't fit. And there's also an answer to both scenarios. So those that conformed proved her right, and those that did not showed how precarious the battle for the survival of Orthodox Zoroastrianism had been in reality. So it was a battle that would be won ultimately by the sanity of Orthodox Zoroastrianism. Right, so it was a foolproof system. It was. I'm also misrepresenting her. Everyone does nowadays. I'm also misrepresenting her. It was extremely intelligent. She was a superb scholar. But in the end, I think this is what made much of it vulnerable. So here we have the one scholar who could have restored interest in Zoroastrianism to the study of religion, but who inscribed in it a teleological and essentially religious narrative that is really difficult to adopt for outsiders. And therefore scholars didn't do it. So that when the most ambitious monumental work on the general history of religion in decades came out, and this is Robert Bella's Religion and Human Evolution of 2011, there is a glaring hole in it. Right? And explicitly, he also discusses this in a footnote. So in the midst of ancient Israel, ancient Greece, India, and China, there is a lacuna, and he says, I would have liked to discuss Iran here, but I just can't make anything of it. And that's not his fault. He was a great scholar, but that is because the information he gets from whatever people have been writing about Zoroastrianism would not enable him sort of to deal with this. The same is true, I think, for Jan Assmann. When Jan Assmann wrote up his insights on revolutionary monotheism, the case that best illustrates many of his points, which is Zoroastrianism, it is passed over in silence. And instead, sort of his theories come to rest on the supposed uniqueness of the case of ancient Israel. And I think Zoroastrianism shows that it wasn't unique. So I know I've taken up too much time of your time. So sorry. So while sort of the aversion to sort of more general theorizing has not been good for Iranian studies, the aversion or the negligence or the ignorance of the history of Zoroastrianism has not been very good for the study of religion. Now, I know I've taken up too much of your time already, so I would like to focus briefly on three big questions posed by Zoroastrianism. One with relevance to general history, one with relevance to the study of religion, and one with relevance to Iranian studies. Yeah. So general history is the 3,000 years. So together with Vedic ritual and together with the Chinese writing system, Zoroastrianism is the only human cultural formation that I know of that still exists, of which I am aware, that has a history spanning more than 3 millennia. So the cognitive distance between its place and time of origin, so Bronze Age, Central Asia, and the urban metropolises of Mumbai and Tehran in the digital age in which now the majority of Zoroastrians are living, it is simply unbelievable. Yeah? So what do we mean? And this is a question that has only very rarely been addressed. What do we mean when we say? What do we say when we say this is the same religion? Right? So how do we construct? This is usually what I do in a teaching context. So we construct in the history of Christianity, for example, we construct a line leading from, let's say, from Paul, from Peter, if you like, to the Reverend, I don't know whom, in 2018, and there's a line, and on this line you can put certain names. So you would have Marcion there, you may not be very happy, Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, etc., and you would end up there. And there's sort of a narrative for us that connects all these people together. There are lines that sort of move away, people whom we no longer sort of consider to belong on this particular timeline, but we actually don't know what we say when there is no instrument which says, well, now they are too different and now they belong. This is why we have endless debates, in my opinion, completely fruitless debates over the question whether Manichaeism was Christianity or not. And the answer to this is no. It was not. So this is, I think, something that Zoroastrianism, together with the two other trimillennials, holds up as a question to general historians. So, how can you explain such a recognizable continuity over such a long period, which is known from the ancient world, but is in most cases of which have not been able to survive? And how do you deal with sort of identifying this as a unitary, as a single thing? The problem with Zoroastrianism is, of course, that much of this history must necessarily remain hypothetical, because we have very few sources for roughly the first half of its trimillennial history. And interestingly, everyone works on these, and we have very many sources for the second half of its trimillennial history, and no one finds them interesting. So that is one thing that I would like to think through. For the study of religion, as I said, Zoroastrianism, in my reconstruction, was the first religion of choice. It was the first religion that worked differently. Many of my colleagues do not believe this, but I have never been very impressed with their counter-arguments. So the permanent debate over this, which is ultimately the debate over the question whether or not Zarathustra was a historical person, whether Zoroastrianism actually began, and the permanent debate over this will not easily seduce students of other religions to take up an interest in this question, but it is a vital one. And for me, at least, the assumption that early Zoroastrianism was a religion of choice is not just part of the history it tells about itself, which is clearly the case. So one of the defining characteristics of this type of religion is that it has a narrative about itself, together with a dramatic ritual simplification, the absence of mythology, and the ability to summarize itself. Right? So it's sort of the assumption is necessary. I mean, that was the point we were saying. So it's not just part of its own history, it's also a necessary assumption. Nothing in Zoroastrian history makes sense, unless you unless you take this claim seriously. So that's one part. That's where I have to fight all my colleagues in the Western studies. I'm coming there in a moment. Alongside this, students of religion should also be interested in the fact that ultimately Zoroastrianism gave up or lost the capacity to attract new members and reformulated itself as an endogamous community. And this is mind-boggling, right? Especially given the competition. I'm unaware of any interesting theory that can help us explain this. I'll skip the unpleasant remarks I have about anthropologists and sociologists, but it is largely because there is no helpful theory on endogamy as such. But Zoroastrianism has sort of the unique quality, I think, for students of religion, that it seems to have been the first religion that was open to converts, and also the first religion that stopped adopting converts. And now, finally, most controversially, Iranian studies. I'm sorry to end a lecture on a festive occasion with a controversial note, but I feel intellectual honesty demands me to go there, and I'll do it quick. So I'll try to hide the controversy as much as I can by being brief. But the point is this: if there is a reality to which the concept of Iran would correspond in early Iranian history, it is the result of Zoroastrianism. Ethnicity is an explosive subject in modern Iranian studies, as it is an explosive reality in modern Iranian societies. It is much more difficult in the ancient Iranian world, which is why I sometimes say we should not call it ancient Iran. But if it exists only in a shape that is wholly determined by a religious narrative. So Iran is a Zoroastrian invention. That narrative was eventually transformed into a national history. And this national history, we know it as the Shahnameh, enabled ultimately the rise of a new Iranian identity that was compatible with Islam. And this too had important consequences for Zoroastrian history, because it tore apart the two branches of the Zoroastrian communities. Right, the Parsis in India, they could and they did maintain a combination of claiming a special religious identity with claiming an ethnic identity. Parsis can say, I am Zoroastrian by religion and Parsi by birth or by ethnicity. Iranian Zoroastrians could not do this. And they could not do this specifically because the vast majority of Muslim Iranians simply would not sort of acknowledge that they had a separate ethnicity. So Iranian Zoroastrians had to re-identify as a community defined by religion alone. And I believe that much of this is work in progress, and that this may help us explain the different dynamics of early modern and modern Zoroastrian history, both in India and in Iran. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have taxed your patience unduly. It is time to come to an end. Iranian studies as a field has a long history of celebrating Iran and its unique history. And while I agree that there is a lot to celebrate, I shall always maintain that celebrating, like all moral judgments, is not an academic activity. It is a good thing, therefore, that this lecture is over, so that we can celebrate the successful first year of the Pourdavoud Center for the Study of the Iranian World without feeling guilty about it. Thank you very much.
Time for very quick and brief questions. Lovely, thanks.
I have two brief questions. When you mentioned the part of geographical explorations and European colonialism, and it's a period that coincides with the first wave or circulation of translations of into European languages of pre-modern Persian literature.
Okay. Yeah.
So I wonder whether you ever have come across references to that, to what extent also the representation, which is very complex, the representation of Zoroastrianism in early Persian literature would sort of play some key role in the way that the religion was perceived from this community, so, which also complicated. The second question I would like to go back to your one of your last statements about the Shahnameh as the first text that crystallizes and reifies, right, the notion of national identity. Do you refer to Ferdowsi's Shahnameh or to different textual stages of the text? I go back God knows how far from back from the 10th century.
It's complicated. So the first question, I think the briefest answer is I don't know. So not in these reports that were written up by colonial administrators. So in Lord and in Gelijns and de Jong, I don't think you see any sort of reception of a learned culture that would have been influenced by the consumption of translated works of Persian, simply because they were sort of economic officials who reported mainly on things they saw and things that the local people told them. You do see, incidentally, that already in Lord, the Shahnameh, because we believe the Shahnameh only became important to the Parsis later in their history, but you see that it's already there. It would be, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. These travelers' reports have been sort of sorted out by Nora Furbier. I think there is much more in them than sort of her encyclopedic book could cover, but I don't recognize this very early. No, so yeah, I've been attacked on this more often, probably also for the right reasons. No, I mean Ferdowsi Shahnameh in the sense of sort of the text that gave rise to a whole genre and to a whole mood. Now I know, and Rahim was there actually when Sarah Savant sort of alerted me to this fact. I know that sort of the Iran Ferdowsi writes about is a country of the past. It's not his own. It's not his own country. It's sort of, it would be Nemo history to speak with Michael Jong for size. But I do think that sort of I wrote something about this a long time ago. I think sort of for people who are interested in pre-Islamic Iran or in sort of Zoroastrianism, essentially, the Shahnameh is the end of a long history. For people who work on Persian literature, it's the beginning of a long history, and somehow these two sort of groups they still don't communicate very well. But I do think that in the adaptation, and of course it has a long prehistory, in the adaptation of this narrative that was part and parcel of a religious sort of literary tradition, and its transformation into something that we would recognize as national history begins with the Shahnameh.
I too was very surprised to see no reference to William Jones and the huge debate that he had with Anquetil Duperron.
Yes, so I had to skip that, but it was actually also not in my text. Yes, no, it's so William Jones led. I mean, it was the same year. I mean, Les Indabasses came out in 1771,
That's right.
and his infamous Lettre à Monsieur A. Dupé came out in the same year, and so he has sparked off a lot of the debate. And it is clear that he was mainly annoyed by the fact that it was a Frenchman who was tarnishing Hyde's reputation. Hyde was the supreme authority on Zoroastrianism, and here you had sort of, so there was a national rivalry going on.
Yeah, when you meant the two-generation debate, it was also two-nation debate between England and France, both of whom had colonial ambitions in India, and therefore, you know, one of them had to be attacked.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
William Jones did attack Anquetil Duperron.
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, you're completely right.
This is not at all the thrust of what your discussion is, but I'm wondering, is there any way that you can hope that, I speak as an archaeologist, that the material remains of any period can help you in sorting out the strands of the development of the religion?
So there's always hope. So far,
so what would you look for?
So far it didn't happen. So Zoroastrianism, especially early Zoroastrianism, in that sense, it is very much like Vedic religion. Sir Jamison would know much more about this. It is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to trace archaeologically. So it doesn't make permanent installations. Essentially, for the performance of ritual, you prepare a ground by drawing a system of furrows into the earth and by removing plants and by building sort of heaps of grass and everything else. You do whatever you have to do. The utensils you use are indistinguishable from domestic ones, and once it's over, you just abandon the ground. So it doesn't leave any trace.
And what about iconography? Can iconography help you, or is that too problematic?
It is very difficult. It is now sort of beginning to become clear for Central Asia. Almost all the relevant sort of Zoroastrian, or some people would say it's something else, but almost all the relevant religious iconography comes from Central Asia. But it is at least a millennium it is at least half a millennium removed from early Zoroastrianism. So I think in that case, but I think the same would be true of early Vedic religion. We just have to give up on the hope of finding sort of material evidence, or in the case of the Avesta, historical references that would help us. I mean, the Avesta is chock full of names, thousands of them, and not a single one refers to a person that we know from any other source. So it is in that sense sort of floating. The only names we can work with are geographical names, so they give us an indication more or less of the area in which some of the later texts, presumably later texts, took shape. But it's in that sense, Zoroastrianism and Vedic religion, they are an enormous intellectual puzzle, because you have to do without all the instruments that biblical scholars and classical scholars have had sort of available to them to make sense of sorting out the relation between a liturgical text or a religious text and the facts on the ground. There are no facts on any ground for us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any last question? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.